Welcome to the sinister side, a place where history reveals its darkest face and the stories left out of textbooks finally come to light. Here, we uncover unsettling events, forbidden truths, and real accounts that continue to echo long after they were meant to be forgotten. Before we begin, we invite you to leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. Whether you've found us in the dead of night or during the quiet hours of the day, we're intrigued to know which parts of the world and what moments in time these disturbing stories reach. Now, take a breath, focus your attention, and step carefully, because once you enter the sinister side, history is no longer as innocent as it seems. The sun had barely begun its ascent over the sprawling fields when the murmurs of the auction began to stir like restless ghosts among the crowd. Dust rose in lazy clouds from the uneven earth as wagons creaked and horses stamped their impatience, their eyes wide and anxious, reflecting the unease that seemed to permeate the air. The plantation's grand auction yard, normally a place of commerce and routine transactions, now felt like a theater for something far darker, an invisible audience awaiting a tragedy that had yet to unfold. Whispers traveled like quicksilver among the attendees, some curious, others cautious, all drawn to the unusual spectacle promised by this particular morning. At the center of it all, standing on a raised wooden platform splintered and weathered by years of use, was the figure that would soon command the attention of every man present, a young, pregnant woman, her hands clasped tightly before her, as if holding not just her dignity but the fragile life growing within her. The sun struck her pale, weather-beaten face in a harsh, unforgiving light, highlighting the tension that seemed to coil through her like a living thing. Her eyes flickered constantly from one spectator to the next, wary and calculating, aware that in this place every glance could conceal judgment, every whisper could mask cruelty. She was a figure suspended between fear and defiance, a trembling promise of life whose value, according to those present, could be measured in mere coins. The master, a tall man with sharp features and a demeanor of cold calculation, surveyed the scene with an expression that betrayed little but commanded much. His gaze swept over the crowd, noting the hardened faces of seasoned traders, the inexperienced curiosity of city men unaccustomed to the raw reality of the plantation, and the faint glimmers of predatory anticipation in those who thrived on the subjugation of others. He had arrived early, as he always did, not merely to purchase labor, but to assert dominance, to remind all who dared watch that he alone set the terms of worth and destiny in this place. Yet today there was something different in his posture, a hint of casual detachment, as though the transaction he was about to make were insignificant, a trifle, barely worth his attention. The auctioneer, a man whose voice could slice through the thick morning air with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, raised his gavel and called the proceedings to order. The sound echoed across the yard, drawing a hush over the crowd that was at once reverent and apprehensive. He spoke with a rhythm that was hypnotic, a cadence meant to coax desire and fear in equal measure, each word dripping with the subtle suggestion that opportunity once missed would vanish forever. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "here stands a woman of remarkable endurance. She bears life within her, a testament to resilience in the face of adversity. What will you offer for such a treasure?" The woe, R&D treasure, hung in the air like smoke, curling and twisting, carrying with it the absurdity of valuing a human life in such cold, transactional terms. Some in the crowd smirked at the irony, others shifted uneasily, uncomfortable with the blunt calculation before them. The pregnant woman remained still, her body rigid as a reed in the wind, listening to words that reduced her existence, her unborn child, and all the silent suffering she had endured to mere currency. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, and yet she forced herself to appear calm, for she knew that any tremor, any hint of desperation, would only diminish her already perilous standing. The bids began, tentative at first, a murmur of low offers whispered among the men who were careful to display neither greed nor eagerness too early. 12 cents. The number was almost laughable in its audacity, yet it landed with a weight that seemed to press upon the woman's chest, as though the air itself had thickened in response. 12 cents, the price of a loaf of bread, the sum of trivial coin, yet it was enough to sway the auctioneer, whose practiced smile barely concealed the disdain in his eyes. 12 cents, he repeated, his tone tinged with mock solemnity. Do I hear more? For a moment, a ripple of disbelief passed through the crowd. Some exchanged glances, eyebrows raised in incredulity, while others nodded approvingly, recognizing the rarity of such a low purchase for someone who, by all appearances, carried the promise of life itself. The master's hand rested lightly on the hilt of his cane, a gesture meant to convey control, though beneath it a quiet calculation stirred. He had not anticipated such a bargain, and yet the absurdity of it intrigued him. 12 cents was barely a trifle, and in his mind it diminished the human before him into something almost mythical, both valuable and negligible, a paradox that fascinated him more than it disturbed. The woman's eyes flickered, a shadow of fear passing across her expression, though she concealed it swiftly. She had known this day would come, had prepared herself for the scrutiny, the harsh assessment of her worth, but she had not anticipated the humiliation of being assigned a price so ludicrously low. Yet there was no room for protest, no voice to rise against the tide of commerce that had swept her onto this platform. She remained silent, a still figure framed by the harsh light of the morning sun, the weight of her situation pressing upon her with relentless force. The auctioneer's gavel rose and fell in a swift, decisive motion, and the sale was confirmed. 12 cents exchanged hands, a meager sum that carried the authority of law and tradition, though it left in its wake an uneasy tension that rippled through the crowd like a spectre. The master gave a curt nod to the auctioneer, signaling that the transaction was complete, then turned his gaze back to the woman. There was a moment of stillness, a fragile pause in which the world seemed to hold its breath, and for an instant the raw absurdity of the situation revealed itself in stark relief. He had purchased a human being, carrying the seed of new life, for less than the cost of a common trinket, yet he treated the act with all the casual gravity of signing a ledger. As the crowd began to disperse, whispering among themselves and casting furtive glances at the unusual scene they had witnessed, the master approached the woman. His steps were measured, deliberate, each one echoing with authority across the wooden platform. She lifted her eyes to meet his, and for a fleeting moment a flicker of recognition passed between them, not of familiarity, but of the unspoken understanding of the stakes now at play. The plantation was a place of rules unspoken but rigidly enforced, and she knew that her existence here would be defined by the whims of those who held power over her. The master's voice broke the silence, calm and controlled, yet carrying an edge that hinted at the subtle cruelty inherent in his nature. "You will follow my instructions," he said, his tone carrying the weight of inevitability. "Any attempt to resist will be noted, and believe me, it will not be met with leniency." The words were simple, almost mundane, but they carried a menace that went beyond the surface, a quiet assertion of dominance that reminded that in this place her body, her child, and her future were no longer her own. She nodded silently, understanding the fragile balance she must now maintain. Every movement, every word, every glance would be scrutinized, measured, and judged. The plantation had its own rhythm, a dark and unforgiving cadence that she would need to learn quickly if she hoped to survive. And yet, beneath the surface of fear, a quiet ember of defiance burned, a recognition that while the world sought to diminish her, the life growing within her remained untouched by the greed and callousness surrounding her. The master led her away from the platform, the sounds of the departing crowd fading into a background murmur, leaving only the heavy silence of the estate and the distant rustle of trees swaying in the early morning breeze. Each step they took seemed amplified, echoing with the weight of decisions not yet made, futures not yet written. He did not speak further, for words were unnecessary. The transaction had been made, the terms were understood, and the power dynamics had been established in a single, chilling exchange. As they entered the shadowed corridors of the estate, the pregnant woman could not help but reflect on the absurdity of her situation. She had been valued at 12 cents, a sum so paltry it seemed almost fictional, yet it had irrevocably altered the course of her life. The price assigned to her existence had stripped away illusions of safety, of autonomy, leaving only the stark reality of her place within this hierarchy of ownership and control. Yet even in that harsh light, the quiet determination to protect her unborn child took root, a seed of hope amidst the despair that surrounded her. The day stretched on with a surreal, oppressive weight. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the fields, and the sounds of labor and routine resumed, though with a faint edge of tension that lingered in the air. Those who had witnessed the auction carried with them the memory of the absurdly low bid, sharing it in hushed tones that mixed disbelief with morbid curiosity. The master remained in his study, reviewing ledgers and correspondence with meticulous attention, his mind already turning to the tasks and calculations that would define the coming weeks. Yet even he could not entirely ignore the peculiar nature of the morning's transaction, the way a life, and a life yet unborn, had been reduced to mere pennies. As evening fell and the estate settled into the quiet rhythms of twilight, the pregnant woman found herself alone for a brief moment, the weight of the day pressing upon her like a tangible force. She placed a hand gently on her swollen belly, feeling the faint, insistent movements of the child within. In that private, fleeting instant, she allowed herself a spark of defiance, a recognition that no matter how the world sought to diminish her, the life she carried was beyond valuation, beyond the reach of cold coin or calculated cruelty. And as darkness fell across the plantation, the echoes of the morning auction lingered like a shadow, a reminder that in this place every breath, every heartbeat, and every secret carried the potential for revelation, for tragedy, and for the inexorable passage of fate. The days following the auction settled into a tense rhythm, each hour stretching like a taut string ready to snap, the pregnant woman's presence a silent reminder of the transaction that had so casually exchanged her life for 12 cents. She moved through the plantation with careful steps, each footfall measured, each gesture deliberate, as if the very act of existing could betray her. Her hands, once idle in the quiet of her own life, were now constantly engaged, tidying, sweeping, performing menial tasks with precision that went unnoticed by the master but kept her mind anchored, a fragile tether to sanity. Yet beneath the surface of this forced routine, a storm raged, one that no observer could see, no overseer could measure, the storm of life growing within her, unacknowledged and unspoken. The pregnancy, still in its early stages, cast a shadow over her every thought, a silent companion in a world that refused to see her as more than property. At night, when the shadows lengthened and the estate fell into a deceptive hush, she would sit alone in the small, cold room assigned to her, her fingers tracing the swell of her belly as though mapping a secret territory no one else was permitted to know. Each movement of the child inside her was a reminder of both vulnerability and power, a quiet rebellion against the diminishment imposed upon her by men who valued her existence in coins. The small life inside her became a focal point, a sanctuary where fear and hope collided, where every heartbeat of the unborn echoed like a drum against the walls of a confined existence. The other slaves, bound by the same chains of circumstance yet differing in experience, cast occasional glances toward her. Some were curious, others wary, sensing that she carried something unique, something that could alter the fragile equilibrium of their daily lives. She spoke little to them, nodding politely but keeping a careful distance, for gossip on a plantation was both currency and weapon, and a careless word could spiral into consequences far beyond imagination. Yet, even in silence, she could feel their awareness, their quiet recognition that she bore within her something untouchable, something that no overseer could price, no master could claim entirely, despite his assumptions of control. The master, for his part, noticed little beyond the externalities of her presence. To him, she performed the tasks expected, obeyed the instructions issued with efficient compliance, and remained inconspicuous. Yet there were moments, fleeting, almost imperceptible, when her eyes would meet his, and a subtle awareness would flicker in that brief exchange, a recognition of shared understanding, unspoken tension, and concealed truths. Though he did not articulate it, a latent suspicion lingered in his mind, a gnawing uncertainty that perhaps the value of this human life was not so easily measured, that beneath the quiet demeanor lay a complexity that could unsettle even the most calculated of intentions. As the weeks passed, her pregnancy became increasingly evident, though she took every precaution to conceal it as much as possible. Loose garments, careful postures, and strategic positioning allowed her to navigate the daily labors without drawing undue attention. She knew, instinctively, that the revelation of her condition could ignite a firestorm of scrutiny, jealousy, or worse, punishment. The mere knowledge that life stirred within her was dangerous, a volatile fact in a world that prized obedience and submission over the chaotic insistence of the human body. And yet, even as she moved cautiously among the fields, carrying buckets of water, hauling wood, and performing endless chores under the sun's merciless gaze, she could not silence the awareness of life itself, thrumming insistently beneath her ribs, demanding recognition, demanding protection. At night, her room became a sanctuary of quiet reflection. The sparse furnishings, the rough wooden floorboards, and the single window that allowed only a sliver of moonlight to enter offered both confinement and refuge. She would sit, tracing the outline of her belly with gentle fingers, feeling the faint, insistent movements of the child, each kick a testament to endurance, a silent declaration of presence. Her mind wandered the rough memories, fleeting visions of her past, of home and family long severed, of moments of fleeting happiness now irretrievably lost. She clung to these recollections as if they were lifelines, fragile yet vital threads connecting her to a humanity the plantation sought to strip away. Fear was a constant companion, lurking in the corners of every room, every corridor, every shadowed path. The possibility of punishment, the threat of exposure, and the weight of societal judgment pressed upon her relentlessly. Yet alongside this fear was an equally persistent determination, a quiet defiance born of necessity. She understood that survival required not only obedience but cunning, not only vigilance but the ability to manipulate perception. Every smile, every nod, every act of apparent compliance was carefully measured to mask the truth of her condition, to protect the small, delicate life growing within her from the harsh, unforgiving world outside her chamber. The plantation itself seemed to conspire in silence, a vast living organism whose rhythms were dictated by labor, power, and fear. The sounds of work, hoes striking earth, wheels grinding against dirt, chains clinking, formed a constant background hum, a reminder of the hierarchy she navigated daily. Yet within this cacophony, her own private reality persisted, insulated from observation, unassailable in its secrecy. She learned to interpret subtle cues, the glance of a fellow slave, the inflection in a master's voice, the cadence of footsteps approaching her quarters, each signal a warning, a piece of intelligence in the delicate dance of survival. Hunger, exhaustion, and the relentless demands of labor tested her body in ways that threatened both herself and the child. There were moments when the weariness pressed so heavily upon her that she felt she might collapse beneath the weight of expectation, yet she endured, drawing strength from the awareness that the life inside her was a separate, resilient force. The child's movements became markers of time, milestones of growth, and in those moments of quiet recognition she found solace, a reminder that despite the oppressive reality surrounding her, creation and persistence could not be entirely extinguished. Interactions with the master remained fraught with subtle tension. He was a man accustomed to control, to the effortless assertion of power over all who lived and worked on his land. Yet even he could not fully ignore the quiet changes in the woman he had purchased for 12 cents. Occasionally, a flicker of awareness would cross his features, a recognition of her condition, or the implication of her resilience, though he dismissed it quickly, masking curiosity with a veneer of indifference. The uncertainty it produced, however, was undeniable, a silent acknowledgement that perhaps some forces on the plantation could not be fully governed, some truths remained elusive. The other slaves, though wary, began to recognize the pattern of our endurance. Some offered small, almost imperceptible gestures of solidarity, a shared glance, a quiet nod, the subtle placement of a bucket in her path to ease her labor. These acts, though minor, carried enormous weight, tiny resistances that communicated understanding and empathy without words. In these silent exchanges, she found fleeting comfort, a reminder that while the plantation sought to isolate and diminish her, human connection persisted, fragile but unbroken. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The swell of her belly became increasingly visible, forcing her to adapt, to refine the careful choreography of concealment. She moved with grace born of necessity, mastering the art of distraction, redirecting attention and manipulating perception. Each chore, each interaction, each moment of apparent compliance was a carefully orchestrated performance, designed to protect the child, preserve her dignity, and maintain a semblance of autonomy within a world determined to strip it away. The psychological toll of silence was immense. She carried not only the physical weight of pregnancy, but also the burden of secrecy, fear, and constant vigilance. Thoughts circled endlessly in her mind. Strategies for survival, reflections on the inequity of her existence, considerations of the future for the life she nurtured. At times, despair threatened to overwhelm, a shadowy presence that whispered of futility and loss. Yet in the quietest moments, when the night pressed close and the sounds of the plantation faded into distant echoes, she found resilience, drawing strength from the unborn child whose movements were a declaration of persistence and hope. Even in the moments of extreme exhaustion, when her muscles screamed in protest and sleep remained elusive, she remained attuned to the child within. Each flutter, each kick, each imperceptible shift was a reminder that life could endure despite oppression, that vitality could persist even in the most hostile environments. This awareness became her anchor, a source of quiet determination that allowed her to navigate the brutal demands of labor, the scrutiny of the master, and the precarious social dynamics among the slaves with a sense of purpose and resolve. Time on the plantation existed as a series of repetitive cycles, yet within these cycles, subtle variations emerged. She noticed the small changes in her own body, the shifts in the master's attention, the nuanced behaviors of those around her. Each observation was catalogued and interpreted, a silent map of threats and opportunities, a strategy for survival that depended on constant vigilance and acute awareness. The pregnancy, once a private reality, had become a lens through which every interaction was refracted, every decision weighed, and every action measured. Her nights were filled with introspection and anticipation, the silence of her quarters a stark contrast to the ceaseless activity beyond the walls. She considered the nature of life, the forces that governed human existence, and the precarious balance between obedience and defiance, concealment and revelation. In these contemplations, she found not despair alone, but a nuanced understanding of power, control, and the resilience inherent in the act of nurturing life in the face of overwhelming adversity. As the months progressed, the child's presence became impossible to ignore, both physically and psychologically. She developed an intimate awareness of every movement, every pattern, every subtle indication of growth. The child became both companion and motivation, a silent testament to endurance, a reason to navigate the perilous world with caution, intelligence, and resolve. She understood that the preservation of this life depended not only on her vigilance, but also on her ability to anticipate danger, to manipulate perception, and to maintain the delicate balance between visibility and concealment. And so, she continued, day after day, hour after hour, the plantation's rhythms and demands pressing upon her relentlessly. She carried her secret with the precision of a scholar, the care of a strategist, and the quiet determination of one who understood that survival was not merely the preservation of the self, but the protection of that which had no voice, no power, yet demanded recognition. The silent pregnancy, a hidden life growing amidst oppression, became a symbol not only of endurance but also of quiet resistance, a force that defied valuation, defied ownership, and defied the cruel calculations of men who believed that all could be measured, all could be controlled, all could be claimed. The shadow of the late brother lingered over the plantation like a spectre, one whose presence was felt more acutely in absence than any corporeal manifestation could convey. Though he had long since passed, his influence had been etched into the land, the routines, and the minds of those who toiled under the sun. The estate itself seemed to carry the memory of him. Corridors whispered his name in the creak of floorboards, rooms retained the faint scent of his lingering authority, and even the wind, as it swept through the trees, seemed to carry the cadence of his long-forgotten commands. The master, his younger sibling, now burdened with both the weight of ownership and the legacy of a man whose shadow refused to dissipate, felt the invisible hand of the deceased brother in every decision, every glance, every silent evaluation of the plantation's inhabitants. It was not only the physical reminders that haunted him, but also the intangible impressions, the invisible lines of expectation drawn across every aspect of his management. The late brother had been a man of ruthless efficiency, a figure whose cruelty had been measured, deliberate, and terrifying in its precision. His authority had not been wielded with chaotic rage, but with a calculating intellect that ensured obedience without overt displays of force, a mastery of control that made rebellion almost unthinkable. Those who had worked under him spoke in hushed tones of his discipline, of the fear that had rooted itself deep within their muscles and minds, a fear that lingered even after his death. Every overseer, every laborer, and even the youngest child born on the plantation had internalized rules established by a man whose presence was now a mere memory, but whose influence had become a permanent architecture of power. The master often found himself standing at the window of his study, gazing across the fields with an awareness that the shadow of his late brother was present in every interaction, every glance, every unspoken judgment from those who still remembered him. The way the laborers bent under the sun, the order in which tasks were executed, the subtle hierarchy among the enslaved individuals, all were reminders of a meticulous hand that had once orchestrated this entire world. There was a certain tension in this memory, a tightening of the chest that accompanied reflections on his siblings' calculated cruelty. It was a tension that mingled with his own sense of pride, a complicated mixture of reverence and resentment, fear and ambition that influenced his every action. Among the slaves, the stories of the late brother had been preserved with a grim reverence. They spoke not only of his efficiency, but of his fascination with control in its most absolute forms. Tales circulated of punishments so precise, so symbolic, that they left psychological scars far deeper than any physical injury could achieve. One such story told of a man who had attempted to steal fruit from the orchard. The brother had not merely punished the theft, but had forced him to reenact the act of taking the fruit over and over, each time under watchful eyes, until the man had internalized obedience as a permanent condition of existence. Stories like these were whispered in corners and shadows, shaping the behaviors of those who worked the fields, ensuring that the machinery of the plantation continued to operate with silent, unbroken efficiency. The late brother's influence extended beyond mere fear, however. He had been a master of observation, understanding human behavior in ways that bordered on the prophetic. He could discern hidden motives, unspoken alliances, and subtle acts of defiance before they had a chance to manifest. His memory served as both a warning and a blueprint for the current master, who found himself occasionally reflecting on the lessons embedded within these recollections. How had his brother managed the complex hierarchy of human beings, the delicate balance of authority, fear, and reward? How had he wielded silence, gaze, and gesture to maintain absolute power over a population inherently resistant to complete domination? These questions haunted the younger sibling, who, while ambitious, understood that the magnitude of the task required not merely effort, but insight born of observation, manipulation, and the cunning use of fear. The plantation itself bore the hallmarks of this meticulous control. Fields were laid out with geometric precision, rows of crops maintained with obsessive care. Every building, every fence, every pathway reflected an underlying order imposed not by chance, but by a mind that understood the potency of environment in shaping behavior. The slaves, conditioned over years, moved within these structures almost instinctively, performing tasks in a rhythm dictated by the legacy of their overseer. And yet, even as the younger master assumed control, he found that some of the subtle mechanisms of fear and influence persisted independently, as if the very soil had absorbed his brother's intentions and continued to exert them silently. It was into this environment that the pregnant slave had been thrust, a new variable in an ecosystem designed for predictability and control. She moved carefully, aware that her every action, however small, would be scrutinized not only by the living, but by the echoes of the dead. The shadow of the late brother seemed to hover in every corner, a reminder of the uncompromising standards that had governed life here. It was not merely the master's expectations she needed to navigate, but the lingering presence of a man whose strategies had been precise and unyielding, whose influence shaped every interaction on the plantation. The child growing within her became a symbol of defiance, a small but potent challenge to the rigid order that had persisted for years. In the master's mind, reflections on his brother often took a darker turn, intersecting with feelings of guilt, rivalry, and fear. The sibling had left behind a reputation that was both admirable and terrifying, one that cast a long, indelible shadow over the current master's authority. There were times when he questioned his own decisions, wondering if he had the cunning, the resolve, and the ruthlessness necessary to manage not only the plantation, but the latent unrest simmering beneath its surface. The presence of the pregnant slave introduced an additional complexity, a moral and practical puzzle that forced him to confront aspects of his brother's methods and philosophy that he had previously considered abstract or irrelevant. Late at night, the estate was filled with a peculiar stillness, broken only by the soft creak of floorboards, the distant cries of nocturnal animals, and the hushed sighs of those who labored under unseen burdens. The master often wandered the halls in solitude, reflecting on the patterns his brother had established and the ways in which they persisted almost independently after death. The shadows seemed longer here, the corners deeper, as if the memory of the late brother had seeped into the walls themselves, embedding a silent vigilance that could not be escaped. Each creaking door, each faint echo of movement, served as a reminder that control was never absolute, that influence, once exercised with precision, cool. Endure beyond mortality, shaping thoughts, actions, and fears in subtle but powerful ways. The slaves themselves were keenly aware of this enduring influence. Their movements, their strategies for survival, their careful attention to gestures and commands, all were informed not only by the living master, but by the remembered discipline of the deceased brother. Some carried tales of his presence with a mixture of fear and reverence, others with a grudging respect for his strategic brilliance. They understood that his legacy was not merely in punishment or cruelty, but in the architecture of control he had established, one that survived through the precision of expectation, the manipulation of perception, and the subtle orchestration of psychological dominance. Among these dynamics, the pregnant slave became a subject of silent calculation, a living presence whose value, risk, and potential consequences were analyzed with careful attention. Her every move, posture, and expression were noted, interpreted, and weighed, not only by the master but by those who had internalized the lessons of his late brother. The unborn child represented an unknown variable, a life not yet fully formed but capable of altering perceptions, loyalties, and hierarchies. It was a quiet, persistent anomaly in a system designed for predictability, a subtle challenge to the established order, and a focal point of tension that heightened the already pervasive sense of unease across the estate. As the weeks and months passed, the master's reflections deepened, often converging on the psychological strategies his brother had employed. He considered the ways in which silence had been wielded as a tool, the meticulous observation that anticipated actions before they occurred, and the quiet but constant presence of authority that shaped behavior almost imperceptibly. In contemplating these methods, he sought not only to emulate them but also to understand their limits, their potential for failure, and the cracks through which unpredictability, represented now by the pregnant slave and the life she carried, might enter the system. The pregnant woman, aware of the weight of these unseen forces, adapted in ways both subtle and deliberate. She moved with precision, masked discomfort with composure, and cultivated an awareness that allowed her to navigate both the immediate commands of the living master and the residual expectations imposed by his late brother. In the quiet corners of her consciousness, she recognized that survival depended not only on obedience, but on understanding, interpreting, and sometimes exploiting the silent rules that governed life on the plantation. Her pregnancy became both a burden and a source of insight, forcing her to consider the implications of every action, every glance, and every whispered conversation. And so the shadow of the late brother persisted, an invisible presence that shaped the rhythms, the fears, and the calculations of all who lived in. Labored under the sun. The master, the slaves, and the pregnant woman themselves were bound by this legacy, navigating a landscape defined as much by memory and expectation as by tangible authority. It was a haunting presence, one that could not be ignored, dismissed, or escaped, a reminder that the dead could exert power over the living in ways both subtle and devastating. And within this intricate web of influence, the unborn child moved quietly, its presence a defiance of control, a harbinger of change, and a silent testament to life's persistence in the face of shadows that refused to fade. The morning air hung heavy with the lingering dampness of overnight dew, clinging to the edges of the plantation like an unseen weight pressing down on everything it touched. The pregnant woman moved with deliberate caution, her steps careful not to disturb the fragile balance of attention surrounding her. Every glance from a passing overseer, every subtle shift of a figure in the distance, carried significance. The world she inhabited was measured in microseconds, in gestures, in the silent acknowledgments of those who recognized both her vulnerability and her quiet resilience. Yet she had learned to navigate it with meticulous precision, each movement choreographed to conceal the swelling life within her, each word measured to avoid attracting scrutiny or ire. That morning, as she carried a basket of laundry toward the drying yard, her mind was focused on the mundane tasks, on the repetitive rhythm of work that allowed her to blend seamlessly into the background. The sun filtered through the canopy of ancient trees, casting patterns of shadow and light across the ground, dappled and shifting like the uncertain currents of fate itself. She'd been careful for weeks, shielding her condition from the gaze of the master and the overseers, manipulating the folds of her garments to obscure any hint of her pregnancy, and managing the curious or envious eyes of the other slaves with quiet diplomacy. But as she bent to hang the linens on the weathered lines, a slip of the tongue, a mere whisper in the wind, threatened to unravel the careful equilibrium she had maintained with such painstaking effort. It began innocuously, almost imperceptibly. She spoke the name of a woman who had once been a companion, a fleeting figure in her memory, long forgotten by the plantation but vivid in her recollection. The name fell from her lips with no intention of consequence, a mere acknowledgement of past kinship, a private echo of a life before chains. Yet in that single utterance, the world shifted. A hush seemed to descend upon the yard, subtle but tangible, as if the air itself had stiffened in response. Heads turned, eyes narrowed, and the faintest flicker of recognition passed through the overseers, who had long learned to read the language of the enslaved. Her own heart lurched in her chest, a sudden wild rhythm that betrayed the calm she had cultivated for months. She looked up slowly, feeling the weight of countless eyes upon her, though no one had spoken a word. The name had carried significance far beyond her understanding, a link between the present and a past she had long sought to bury. The master, who had been inspecting the work of the fields from the veranda, froze mid-step, his gaze locking onto her with an intensity that pierced through her carefully constructed facade. It was a look that conveyed disbelief, suspicion, and the subtle trembling of a realization that had begun to unfurl in his mind, like a shadow creeping over a familiar landscape. The master's hand tightened around the railing of the veranda, knuckles whitening as the threads of memory, half buried and long ignored, began to pull taut within him. The name she had spoken carried implications he could not yet fully articulate, but the instinctive recognition of its meaning set his pulse into a rapid, uneven rhythm. His late brother's presence, already a spectral influence over the estate, seemed to coalesce in that instant, its force magnified by the revelation now hinted at in the woman's casual utterance. A connection, previously hidden, had been exposed, delicate but undeniable, and the consequences of this exposure began to press upon him with an almost unbearable weight. The air around the woman seemed to thicken, each breath drawn becoming a conscious act of defiance and survival. She understood, in the instinctive and unspoken language of fear and intuition, that the utterance of this name had altered the dynamics of the plantation irrevocably. Her own vulnerability was magnified, now intertwined with the curiosity and suspicion of a master whose mind had been sharpened by years of inheritance and observation. The subtle glances of fellow slaves carried a new intensity as they too perceived the shift, the disruption of equilibrium that had been so meticulously maintained. Questions rose in the master's mind with a relentless insistence. How had this name come to her lips? What connections, what secrets did it imply? The careful architecture of control, the systems of obedience and fear so meticulously constructed over years, trembled in the presence of this small, almost accidental revelation. He had purchased her for 12 cents, had considered her value in terms of labor and subservience, and yet now he faced the uncomfortable recognition that her existence, and that of the child she carried, might be entangled with legacies he had long thought settled and contained. The woman, sensing the weight of his gaze, stiffened. Her survival depended on her ability to project composure, to maintain the carefully constructed image of compliance and insignificance. Yet beneath the surface, a torrent of anxiety surged, propelled by the knowledge that the spoken name had opened a door she could not close. The unborn child, silent and insistent, seemed to echo this tension, a pulse of life that defied the chains of circumstance, and the cold calculations of men who sought to assign worth based on obedience and labor. In the ensuing moments, the atmosphere became charged with an unspoken tension, a collision of history, memory, and present reality. The master's mind raced through recollections of his late brother, piecing together fragments of encounters, conversations, and observations, seeking to understand how this single name could carry such power. He recalled the meticulous precision of the deceased sibling, the strategic cunning that had governed his every decision, the way he had manipulated perception, control, and fear with near mystical foresight. And now, it seemed, some hidden strand of that influence had entwined itself with the present, manifesting through a name and a woman he had underestimated, reducing him momentarily to the role of a man confronted by forces he could barely comprehend. The other slaves, perceiving the sudden shift, adjusted their behavior accordingly. Some averted their eyes, fearing that any glance could be construed as knowledge or complicity. Others whispered in hushed tones among themselves, careful to remain inaudible to the master, yet sharing the ripple of unease that the spoken name had initiated. Even the animals seemed to sense the change, the horses stamping nervously in their stalls, the dogs lowering their heads as though aware that tension, human and otherwise, had permeated the air. The pregnant woman continued her tasks with the precision of a seasoned actor, masking her fear beneath layers of routine and subtle gestures designed to convey compliance. Telly, hand to chin, eyes narrowing in concentration, as he attempted to trace the connections, anticipate consequences, and plan for the inevitable shifts that this revelation would provoke within the dynamics of the plantation. The pregnant woman, meanwhile, moved with heightened awareness, sensing the subtle changes in the master's demeanor, the unspoken weight of his thoughts, and the delicate scrutiny now directed toward her. Every glance she received, every word spoken in passing, was filtered through layers of caution, calculation, and observation. She understood, instinctively, that her utterance had irrevocably altered the course of events, introducing uncertainty into a system long governed by predictability and fear. And yet, within this perilous reality, she found a measure of empowerment, however fragile, the knowledge that a single word, a simple name, could influence perception, challenge assumptions, and disrupt control. Evening approached, and with it, a deceptive quiet that blanketed the plantation. Shadows lengthened, merging with the natural darkness, creating spaces where observation was difficult, where secrets could be nurtured and concealed. In her quarters, the woman allowed herself a moment of reflection, considering the weight of the day's events and the implications of the spoken name. The child within her shifted, a subtle reminder that life continued despite fear, despite surveillance, despite the heavy hand of history pressing upon them. It was a pulse of defiance, a quiet assertion of presence in a world that sought to suppress it. Night fell fully, bringing with it a hushed stillness punctuated only by distant cries of nocturnal creatures and the soft murmur of the wind through the trees. The master retired to his chambers, restless and consumed by thought, replaying the morning's events with obsessive attention. He considered the name, the context in which it had been spoken, the possible connections to his late brother, and the ripple effects it could have on the carefully constructed hierarchy of the estate. Each realization seemed to pull him deeper into a labyrinth of uncertainty, where assumptions could no longer be trusted, and control was an illusion at best. The pregnant woman, lying on the narrow cot in her sparsely furnished room, felt a strange mixture of fear and vindication. The utterance of a single name had shifted the landscape of her existence, introducing variables she could neither fully predict nor entirely control. Yet she had survived thus far through careful observation, precise action, and an intimate understanding of human behavior under duress. The life growing within her remained a source of quiet defiance, a testament to endurance and to the unpredictable potency of existence itself. And as the night deepened, the plantation seemed to hold its breath, suspended between revelation and consequence, between fear and anticipation. The spoken name had shattered illusions, revealed hidden connections, and set in motion a series of events whose full ramifications would unfold slowly, inevitably, and inexorably. Within this web of tension, the pregnant woman remained vigilant, the master restless, and the shadow of the late brother stretching silently across all who lived and labored under the sun, a reminder that some truths, once spoken, could never be unspoken. The days following the accidental revelation of the name were shrouded in a tense, suffocating silence that seemed to settle over the plantation like a creeping fog. Every sound, the distant clatter of tools, the soft rustle of leaves, the murmur of slaves moving through the fields, felt amplified, charged with meaning and potential consequence. The master's thoughts were restless, looping endlessly, a chain of obsessions that he could not break. The name the woman had spoken haunted him, stirring memories of his late brother, conjuring possibilities he had not dared consider, and forcing him to confront truths long buried beneath layers of calculation and denial. The pregnant woman, aware of the shifting currents around her, moved cautiously, acutely conscious that every glance, every word, could now carry an extra weight, a subtle interrogation of meaning. The air was different, charged with suspicion and tension, and she felt it pressing against her like an invisible hand. She had long learned to navigate the mechanisms of the plantation, to anticipate consequences, to manipulate perception to her advantage, yet now the landscape had altered, subtly but irrevocably, and her survival depended on a combination of instinct, observation, and the quiet defiance that had been nurtured within her since the day she had stepped onto the auction platform. The master's scrutiny intensified with each passing day. He observed her closely, noting gestures, inflections, and subtle shifts in posture that might reveal knowledge or connection beyond what she revealed in her tasks. Every action was analyzed, cross-referenced with recollections of his late brother, and dissected for meaning. He found himself drawn into a labyrinth of thought where memory, suspicion, and speculation intertwined, creating a shadowy framework through which every moment of the woman's life was filtered. The very air of the plantation seemed to thicken with unspoken questions, and he felt the weight of the past bearing down on the present in ways that unsettled even his disciplined mind. It was during one quiet afternoon, as the sun cast long, slanting shadows across the fields, that a subtle revelation began to surface. The woman, unaware that she was being scrutinized, allowed a slip of expression, a fleeting familiarity, a hesitation, a flicker of recognition, as she recounted a task performed days earlier in the northern section of the estate. The master noticed it immediately, his mind seizing upon the smallest detail, drawing connections and forcing interpretations. He remembered conversations, whispers, and nuances of behavior that had seemed trivial at the time, but now coalesced into a pattern, a hidden narrative slowly revealing itself with undeniable clarity. The realization came in fragments, each a sharp, disconcerting piece of truth. The child growing within her was not merely a product of circumstance. Its father was a man whose influence, though silent, had lingered far longer than the living could observe. The late brother, whose shadow haunted every corner of the estate, whose presence had been felt in the architecture of obedience and control, had been connected to this woman in ways that had been carefully concealed, deliberately ignored, and socially taboo. The master, confronting this reality, felt a complex swirl of shock, disbelief, and a gnawing sense of betrayal. The implications were profound, unsettling the very foundations of his understanding of his family, the estate, and the order he had so carefully sought to maintain. The woman, still unaware of the full scope of recognition, continued her labor, moving with the practiced ease of one who understood the necessity of invisibility. Yet even in her diligence, subtle signals betrayed knowledge, emotion, and memory. The delicate inflection of a word, the hesitation of a glance, the unconscious adjustment of posture. The master's observation intensified, his mind weaving these signals into a tapestry of understanding that revealed the hidden truth, layer by layer. Each piece confirmed the suspicions that had been forming in his consciousness since the morning the name was spoken, a revelation as inevitable as it was devastating. Fear, once a distant companion, became immediate, a tangible pressure that pressed upon the woman's chest. Though she did not yet know the full extent of the master's awareness, the atmosphere itself seemed to signal change. The air was heavier, charged with the tension of imminent revelation, of secrets poised on the brink of exposure. The unborn child, small and insistent, moved within her with a subtle force, a quiet heartbeat that mirrored the rhythm of revelation that pulsed through the estate. In the silence of the fields, the unspoken truth hovered like a spectre, waiting for recognition, acknowledgement, and consequence. The master's thoughts were a whirlwind of calculation and emotion, shock mingled with disbelief, a visceral understanding of the interconnectedness of past actions and present consequences. The late brother, whose presence had shaped the very fabric of the plantation, had left a legacy more complicated and morally tangled than he had ever imagined. The realization that the child she carried was his brother's bloodline ignited a complex mixture of emotions: rage at the deceit, sorrow for the moral transgression, and an uneasy fascination with the consequences that were now unavoidable. Each emotion was compounded by the awareness that societal norms, familial honor, and the fragile hierarchy of the estate could not absorb SUC. A revelation without fracture. In the following days, the plantation operated under a tense equilibrium, a fragile balance maintained by the unspoken acknowledgement of truth on one side and the careful concealment of emotion on the other. The master observed her constantly, yet no outward sign of his awareness was displayed. He knew that any overt reaction could jeopardize his control, provoke unrest, or inadvertently reveal his own vulnerability to those under his authority. Thus, he concealed the storm raging within, each measured word and controlled gesture an exercise in maintaining order, while the hidden truth settled into the foundation of the estate. The woman sensed the subtle shift, though she could not comprehend its source. The gaze of the master lingered more insistently, the tone of instructions carried an undercurrent of intensity, and the subtle movements of overseers seemed attuned to a change in the air. Her instincts, honed over months of careful observation, informed her that the dynamics had altered, that the stakes had grown higher, and that the life she carried now represented not just personal hope, but a dangerous anomaly within a system meticulously structured for predictability and obedience. The revelation, though unspoken, began to infiltrate the daily interactions on the estate. Conversations, though seemingly mundane, carried subtle undercurrents of tension. Tasks were completed with heightened attention to detail, movements were calculated to avoid drawing suspicion, and the silent interplay of observation and anticipation created a lattice of psychological tension that enveloped all who lived and labored there. The pregnant woman's presence became both a catalyst and a focal point, a living reminder of a truth that could not be ignored, even if it remained unspoken. Late at night, when the plantation fell into an almost unnatural quiet, the master would pace his study, considering the moral, practical, and social implications of what he had discovered. The child's paternity, entwined with the shadow of his late brother, presented challenges beyond immediate control, raising questions of legitimacy, inheritance, and social standing. Each possibility he considered carried weight, potential consequences, and moral ambiguity, forcing him to confront aspects of his own character and judgment he had long preferred to ignore. The pregnant woman, lying awake in her small quarters, felt a persistent sense of unease that she could neither name nor fully understand. Her instincts whispered that she had crossed an invisible threshold, that the dynamics of power, secrecy, and control had been altered in ways that imperiled her existence. Yet she drew strength from the child within her, whose heartbeat offered a subtle affirmation of life, endurance, and quiet defiance against the rigid structures designed to subjugate her. Each movement, each flutter, was a reminder that she was not entirely powerless, that within her bod lay a force capable of altering perception, challenging authority, and enduring despite circumstance. Days blurred into weeks as the implications of the hidden truth continued to unfold. The master maintained a veneer of normalcy, overseeing the work of the estate with meticulous attention while internally grappling with revelations that threatened to destabilize the carefully maintained hierarchy. The woman adapted to the heightened scrutiny, her movements measured, gestures precise, words chosen with extreme caution. Every interaction became a delicate negotiation, a balancing act between self-preservation, concealment, and the instinctual drive to protect the life growing within her. The tension was palpable, a pervasive presence that colored the atmosphere of the plantation. Animals sensed it, reacting to subtle cues. Laborers adjusted their behavior, consciously or unconsciously. Even the very architecture of the estate seemed to reflect the unease, the creaking floorboards and shifting shadows mirroring the uncertainty that had seeped into every corner. The hidden truth was no longer a private concern. It had become a force that influenced action, perception, and thought. A silent but undeniable presence, shaping the daily existence of all who dwelled on the estate. Through it all, the pregnant woman endured, drawing upon the quiet reserves of strength that had sustained her from the auction platform to the present. Her knowledge of human behavior, her acute observation of patterns, and her ability to adapt to shifting dynamics became crucial tools in navigating this new reality. She understood that the revelation of her child's paternity, though hidden, had already set in motion forces that could not be controlled entirely, and that survival required vigilance, intelligence, and the careful management of perception. And so the hidden truth, once obscured by silence, began to assert itself in subtle but profound ways. It influenced the master's decisions, colored interactions with the enslaved, and transformed the atmosphere of the plantation. The unborn child became both a symbol and a catalyst, embodying resilience, defiance, and the unsettling power of secrets revealed. In the shadow of this revelation, the estate continued its relentless rhythms, yet every moment was tinged with the weight of knowledge, anticipation, and the inexorable consequences of truths that could no longer remain hidden. The revelation of the hidden truth did not linger quietly in the corners of the estate. It demanded attention, pulling the master into a labyrinth of emotions so complex, so darkly intertwined, that they threatened to consume him entirely. Guilt, rage, and the gnawing question of inheritance gnawed at the edges of his consciousness, intertwining with every decision, every glance, every interaction. He walked the halls of the mansion in restless pacing, the polished floorboards reflecting both the sunlight streaming through the tall windows and the turbulent storm of his mind. Shadows lengthened across the room, stretching toward him like accusatory fingers, as though the very walls had absorbed the moral weight of his late brother's actions, of his own complicity, and of the unsettling reality now revealed in the pregnant woman. Guilt was the first to take hold, creeping like a cold, unrelenting fog. It was a guilt not born merely of the societal transgression or the violation of taboo, but of a more intimate, almost visceral recognition of failure. He realized that his assumptions, his dismissals, and his casual calculation of human value had obscured a truth so profound that it altered everything. 12 cents had bought a life, yes, but it had also concealed within it a connection that reached into the very legacy of his family. The unborn child, a living extension of a man long gone, carried with it implications of blood, inheritance, and the tangled web of familial loyalty and secrecy. This child was more than property. It was a reminder of human frailty, ambition, and moral compromise, a tangible manifestation of consequences that he could neither ignore nor fully control. Rage followed swiftly, a violent counterpoint to the creeping guilt. It was directed outward and inward, a tempest of emotion that shook the foundations of his reason. He felt anger at his late brother, whose hidden actions and unspoken desires had created this impossible situation, at the woman who bore the child, though he knew rationally that she was blameless, and at himself for his oversight, his complacency, his failure to anticipate the ramifications of inherited power. The master's rage was an invisible storm, pressing upon every soul on the plantation, bending perception and attention toward tension, suspicion, and fear. It was a rage that could not be voiced, for to articulate it fully would unravel the delicate structures of authority he had spent years cultivating. and yet it demanded acknowledgement, seeping into every calculated expression, every measured word, and every shadowed glance. The question of inheritance became the focal point of this internal struggle. He had long assumed the simplicity of succession, the clear delineation of assets, labor, and land, but the revelation of the child's parentage disrupted every expectation. Could this unborn life, a product of a morally forbidden union, stake any claim, social, familial, or material, within the rigid hierarchies of the plantation? Could the child alter perceptions, obligations, or even power dynamics among those who had long assumed stability? These questions were not abstract, they were immediate, pressing, and dangerous, pressing upon him with a force that was as psychological as it was moral. He found himself obsessively considering scenarios, calculating outcomes, imagining confrontations and compromises, and yet understanding, with a grim clarity, that some consequences could not be contained, that life itself had introduced variables beyond the reach of calculation. As he moved through the estate, the subtle manifestations of this tension were everywhere. The workers sensed the shift, the careful, measured scrutiny applied to every motion and every gesture. The pregnant woman became an axis around which these dynamics spun, her presence a quiet but insistent reminder that the legacy of the late brother extended beyond memory and into flesh and blood. She carried with her the unspoken truth, an invisible weight that influenced thought, action, and the unsteady equilibrium of the plantation's social structure. Her every movement, now under heightened observation, became both a survival strategy and an unwitting tool in the complex web of suspicion and calculation. The nights were worst of all. In the solitude of his study, the master wrestled with insomnia, haunted by images of the child he had not yet seen, of the woman who bore it, and of the late brother whose shadow seemed to pulse in the corners of the room. Every creak of floorboards, every whisper of wind, every distant call of an animal seemed amplified, charged with portent. He imagined conversations that had never occurred, confrontations that might never happen, and judgments that were inevitable but terrifying in their scope. The moral and social implications of inheritance, legitimacy, and reputation became as tangible as the furniture surrounding him, oppressive and unavoidable. Guilt, too, was compounded by memory. He recalled his brother's exacting nature, the subtle manipulations, the long-term strategies for control, and the precise ways in which authority had been exercised over every individual on the estate. The younger master recognized, with a mix of awe and horror, that he had inherited not only wealth and responsibility, but the consequences of choices made in secrecy and passion, decisions that had far-reaching implications he was only now beginning to grasp. In this realization, guilt and rage fused into a complex, almost paralyzing awareness that his control over the estate, over the slaves, and over the unfolding legacy was neither absolute nor certain. The pregnant woman, meanwhile, remained acutely aware of the intensifying scrutiny. She moved with caution, mastering the delicate dance between visibility and concealment, understanding that her survival depended on both obedience and insight, and that the life growing within her represented both vulnerability and power. Her presence became a mirror, reflecting not only the moral complexity of the master's conscience, but also the latent anxieties embedded within the hierarchy of the plantation. The unborn child was a living secret, a force capable of shaping perception, revealing hidden truths, and challenging the rigid social order that had long been assumed immutable. Interactions between the master and the woman were laden with subtle tension, unspoken questions, and silent negotiation. Each glance, each gesture, each carefully chosen word carried layered meaning, a test of knowledge, composure, and perception. The master struggled to reconcile his personal emotions, rage, guilt, fascination, with the practical need to maintain authority, to preserve order, and to conceal awareness of the hidden truth. His obsession with inheritance and legitimacy added a moral dimension to his calculations, transforming everyday interactions into psychological minefields where a single misstep could have catastrophic consequences. The estate itself seemed to respond to these dynamics. The air felt heavier, charged with the latent tension between observation and concealment. Even the simplest routines, feeding livestock, tending crops, repairing fences, were now infused with an awareness of stakes previously unrecognized. Every observer, from the most senior overseer to the newest laborer, was sensitive, in one way or another, to the subtle changes in behavior, to the altered cadence of authority, and to the invisible pressures exerted by a secret that had begun to surface with undeniable force. In private moments, the master's mind spiraled through contingency after contingency. Could the child, born of a morally forbidden union, assert any claim to inheritance or recognition? Could the revelation of paternity provoke resentment, rebellion, or unrest among those who had long assumed a stable hierarchy? He imagined the judgment of neighbors, the scrutiny of distant relatives, and the long-term implications for the plantation's legacy. Each scenario was more unsettling than the last, each resolution more morally ambiguous, and each potential outcome a source of both fascination and dread. The pregnant woman's awareness of her own power, fragile, covert, and largely unrecognized, grew with each passing day. She understood that the secret she carried was a silent, persistent force, influencing behavior, perception, and control. Her ability to navigate this tension, to survive the gaze of the master and the scrutiny of those around her, relied upon subtle observation, instinct, and the quiet defiance represented by the life within her. Each movement of the child, each heartbeat, became both reassurance and affirmation, a reminder that life could persist even amidst oppression, secrecy, and moral complexity. The convergence of guilt, rage, and the question of inheritance reached a peak in moments of solitude. The master, pacing in his study, imagined confrontations that had not yet occurred, possibilities for negotiation, and strategies for maintaining authority while grappling with the moral implications of the revelation. He understood that the child represented not only a challenge to familial expectations, but also a test of his own capacity for control, judgment, and ethical reasoning. The silent presence of the woman and her unborn child forced him to confront questions of morality, legitimacy, and human value in ways that no ledger, record, or system of labor could adequately contain. The estate, in all its sprawling complexity, became a stage for the intricate interplay of these forces. Fields, quarters, and corridors were imbued with tension, each space charged with anticipation, suspicion, and the unspoken recognition of a truth that had begun to permeate every facet of life. The pregnant woman, her movements deliberate and precise, remained both observer and participant, navigating this charged environment with intelligence, caution, and resilience. The unborn child, silent yet insistent, was both witness and catalyst, a living embodiment of secrets revealed and consequences yet to unfold. In the quiet hours of the night, as shadows lengthened and the world beyond the plantation fell into a deceptive stillness, the master reflected upon the convergence of guilt, rage, and the inexorable question of inheritance. He recognized with a mixture of horror and reluctant awe that this revelation was not merely a disruption of routine, but a profound challenge to authority, morality, and the understanding of human connection. The child represented more than potential labor or social complication. It was a force of truth, persistence, and unassailable consequence, demanding acknowledgement in ways that no amount of calculation, control, or cruelty could fully suppress. The pregnant woman, lying awake on her narrow cot, felt the subtle vibrations of the estate's tension around her. The silence, punctuated only by distant calls of animals and the wind whispering through trees, was thick with expectation. She understood instinctively that the secret she carried had introduced variables beyond her control, yet could be navigated with intelligence, caution, and patience. Each movement of the child within her became a source of guidance, a quiet assertion of life and resilience that mirrored the moral and social turbulence surrounding her. And so the plantation continued its relentless rhythms, though now under the influence of forces both hidden and visible. Guilt, rage, and the question of inheritance intertwined, shaping behavior, perception, and authority in ways that were both subtle and profound. The pregnant woman and her unborn child became central to this intricate web, their presence a constant reminder that human life, secrecy, and moral complexity could not be fully contained or controlled. Within this tension, Every day became a negotiation of survival, power, and understanding, and every moment was infused with the quiet, inexorable influence of hidden truth asserting itself upon the world. The plantation, once a place of strict order and predictability, had transformed into a labyrinth of tension and fear, each corner and corridor carrying whispers of a truth that had been hidden too long. The master, consumed by the knowledge of the pregnant slave's connection to his late brother, walked the halls in a restless haze, his mind spinning with thoughts both rational and obsessive, the weight of inheritance, secrecy, and moral complexity pressed upon him like a physical burden, bending the sunlight that streamed through the tall windows into shadows that seemed to mock his inability to fully control the unfolding situation. Each step he took echoed with the unspoken implications of the child she carried, a life whose existence challenged everything he thought he understood about authority, family, and power. It was on a humid afternoon, when the air hung heavy with the scent of earth and sweat, that the horrifying clarity of discovery struck. He had been inspecting the northern fields, where laborers moved with the practiced precision of those who had long internalized fear and order. His gaze, however, was not on the crops or the tools, but on the woman herself, moving quietly among the others, her gestures deliberate, her eyes cast down in a manner designed to avoid notice. And yet, despite the careful choreography, a subtle truth revealed itself in her posture, the gentle swell of her body, the almost imperceptible way she moved to protect the life growing within her. It was a truth that struck him not as revelation, but as an unbearable confrontation, a collision of morality, biology, and the undeniable presence of bloodline. He recalled the family records, ledgers, and private correspondences he had pored over in the dead of night, piecing together fragments of history, half-forgotten encounters, and whispered conversations. And now, standing in the middle of the field, he saw it with unrelenting clarity. The woman carried the child of his late brother. The realization was more than shocking, it was horrific, a twisting of his understanding of family, legitimacy, and morality that threatened to unravel the very foundations of his mind. He staggered slightly, gripping the edge of a wooden fence for support, the heat of the afternoon sun unnoticed as the storm of understanding consumed him. The implications were manifold and terrifying. The child, a living testament to a morally and socially forbidden union, represented a challenge to the established hierarchy of the plantation, to the expectations of neighbors, and to the rigid social codes that had governed behavior for generations. To acknowledge the truth openly would risk scandal, rebellion, and destabilization. To ignore it would be to live with the constant, gnawing knowledge that control had slipped through his fingers, that the legacy he sought to protect was quietly shifting in ways he could neither prevent nor predict. Rage and fear mingled within him, twisting into a poisonous coil that threatened to dictate actions he might later regret. He began to observe her with increasing intensity, studying every movement, every expression, every interaction with those around her. He noticed the subtle ways she adapted her tasks to shield the child, the careful avoidance of attention, the instinctive strategies she employed to survive under scrutiny. Each observation intensified his horror, for it was not merely the revelation of parentage that disturbed him, but the undeniable demonstration of her intelligence, her resourcefulness, and her resilience. The child within her was not simply an extension of his brother, it was a living challenge to his assumptions about dominance, obedience, and the malleability of human will. The estate itself seemed to respond to this revelation. Animals sensed the tension, moving with an almost human awareness of the stakes. Horses stamped nervously in their stalls, dogs lowered their heads, and even the crops seemed to sway with the weight of unspoken anxiety. The laborers, too, though unaware of the full truth, adjusted their behavior to subtle cues, posture, tone, gesture, that indicated the master's heightened vigilance and internal turmoil. The atmosphere of the plantation became thick with unspoken recognition, a charged space where secrets, power, and fear intertwined in a complex web, all centered upon the pregnant woman and the child she carried. In his private quarters, the master confronted the full spectrum of his emotions, guilt mingled with anger, moral revulsion with reluctant fascination, fear with an obsessive need to understand, control, and anticipate. He questioned his own complicity, the assumptions he had made regarding value, obedience, and authority. and the ways in which he had underestimated the consequences of human behavior beyond his control. The child, though not yet born, had become an agent of revelation, a living embodiment of forces beyond reason and calculation, forcing the master to grapple with questions of justice, morality, and legacy he had long avoided. Sleep became impossible. Nights were spent in pacing, reflection, and obsessive calculation. He replayed moments in the fields, gestures, words, and silences, examining each with microscopic attention for signs of recognition or knowledge. The knowledge of parentage, once abstract, became a fixed reality, and the weight of inheritance, social expectation, and moral consequence pressed upon him with relentless force. Each creak of the floorboards, each distant sound, became a reminder of the inescapable truth. The child's existence could not be ignored, contained, or erased. The pregnant woman, meanwhile, remained acutely aware of the subtle changes in the master's behavior. She noticed his gaze lingering, the way his instructions carried an undertone of unarticulated concern, and the heightened vigilance of those around her. Her instincts, sharpened by months of observation and survival, allowed her to navigate this environment with extraordinary precision. She moved with careful deliberation, masking fear and awareness alike, understanding that every gesture could be scrutinized, every word interpreted, and every action potentially weaponized against her. Yet in this precarious balance, she also felt a quiet empowerment, knowing that the truth she carried was a force beyond the control of even the most powerful man on the estate. Master's horror intensified as he considered the broader implications. The child represented not only familial complication, but social upheaval. Neighbors, relatives, and the wider community, once assumed to be indifferent or compliant, could become arbiters of judgment, their perceptions and actions unpredictable and potentially ruinous. To acknowledge the truth openly was to invite scandal. To conceal it was to live with a constant, gnawing anxiety. Each decision, each pause, each interaction became a moral and strategic calculation, the consequences of which could ripple through the estate and beyond in ways he could not fully predict. In his study, he pored over ledgers, records, and letters, seeking any precedent, any guidance, any hint of a solution to the impossible situation that had been revealed. Every document seemed insufficient, inadequate to the gravity of the revelation. The child, growing silently and invisibly within the woman, had become the axis around which his thoughts, fears, and obsessions revolved. The horror lay not only in the moral complexity, but in the recognition that the forces of life, secrecy, and inheritance were beyond full control, capable of asserting themselves in ways that no ledger, law, or physical authority could contain. The pregnant woman, lying in the quiet of her small room, could feel the shift in energy across the plantation. Even without words, she perceived the tension, the heightened scrutiny, the subtle alterations in behavior that signaled the master's obsessive awareness. Her body, carrying the living secret, was both a site of vulnerability and power. She understood that the child was more than a passive entity. It was a force that shaped perception, influenced decision-making, and threatened the carefully maintained hierarchy of the estate. Every movement, every heartbeat, every shift of position was a silent declaration of presence and endurance, a quiet defiance against the oppressive structures that surrounded her. The realization of this horrifying truth, this impossible intersection of family, inheritance, and human consequence, drove the master to obsession. He examined the past, reconstructing his brother's actions, recalling conversations, noting patterns of behavior, and searching for hidden evidence of relationships long assumed to be irrelevant or extinguished. The process consumed him, leaving little room for reflection on anything else, as if the child and the woman who carried it had become the singular focus of his consciousness. Sleep, sustenance, and social interaction became secondary to the relentless pursuit of understanding, control, and perhaps unconsciously, absolution. Meanwhile, the pregnant woman adapted with extraordinary acuity. Her movements were deliberate, her words carefully measured, and her perception of the master's obsessions guided her choices. She learned to navigate the shifting dynamics with a blend of patience, intelligence, and subtle manipulatio, protecting both herself and the child. In this dangerous dance, she exercised a quiet but profound power, one that was invisible yet undeniable. capable of influencing thought, shaping behavior, and preserving life amidst conditions designed to suppress both. The estate became a stage for the intricate interplay of horror, awareness, and consequence. Fields, quarters, corridors, and rooms all carried the weight of the revelation, a palpable tension that informed every interaction, every movement, and every decision. The pregnant woman, the master, and the unseen forces of inheritance, secrecy, and moral reckoning converged to create a landscape where the unspoken held immense power, and where the life growing quietly within her challenged assumptions, authority, and social order alike. In the quiet of night, as shadows deepened and the world beyond the estate faded into darkness, the master confronted the full magnitude of the horrifying discovery. The child was more than a secret, it was a revelation, a force, a moral and social earthquake that demanded attention, recognition, and careful negotiation. The woman, meanwhile, remained both resilient and strategic, aware of the potency of the truth she carried, the subtle influence it exerted, and the delicate balance required to survive in a world both oppressive and unpredictable. And so, the plantation existed in a new reality, defined by fear, awareness, and the inescapable consequences of revelation. The master's horror, the woman's vigilance, and the silent insistence of life itself created a tension that permeated every space, influenced every action, and reshaped the landscape of authority, morality, and inheritance. Within this charged atmosphere, every moment became a negotiation, every decision a potential pivot, and every heartbeat a reminder that the hidden, unspoken truths of human life could wield a power far greater than chains, wealth, or fear alone. The plantation, once rigidly structured by the authority of the master and the shadow of his late brother, had transformed into a space governed as much by fear and vigilance as by tradition or labor. The revelation of the hidden parentage of the pregnant slave's child had altered the fabric of existence across the estate. Each day was a delicate negotiation of observation, suppression, and silent assertion of power, where the living and the unborn collided with legacy, morality, and control in ways that none could entirely predict. The pregnant woman, carrying within her the seed of forbidden lineage, moved with extraordinary caution, aware that every gesture, every glance, every subtle signal could shape the course of events, influence perception, and dictate survival. The master, still consumed by the horrific discovery, oscillated between obsession and strategy. He found himself retracing every past action, every decision, every interaction, to understand the extent to which the hidden truth had been concealed and the ways and which it might now influence the present. The child was not merely an anomaly, it was a living testament to consequences unaccounted for, a force that challenged assumptions, authority, and social hierarchy. As he watched her from the veranda, observing the rhythm of her labor and the quiet dignity with which she navigated the plantation, he felt both rage and awe, a recognition of human resilience that defied his control, even as it threatened the order he had long maintained. The fear that had been instilled across generations of laborers took on a new dimension. The pregnant woman, aware of both her vulnerability and her unique position, adapted with meticulous precision. She learned to interpret the subtle signals of attention, to anticipate moments of scrutiny, and to manipulate perception without revealing knowledge. Every movement became a careful calculation, designed to protect the life within her and to maintain a delicate equilibrium between submission and agency. Her awareness of her own power, silent yet profound, became a form of quiet resistance, an assertion of survival against an oppressive system designed to deny autonomy, value, and voice. Even the natural environment seemed complicit in the creation of tension. The wind that rustled through the trees carried whispers of anticipation. The swaying of the crops seemed to mimic the unsettled rhythm of the estate, and the animals moved with heightened alertness, sensing the invisible currents of fear and power that pervaded every space. The plantation itself had become a living, breathing entity, a reflection of the psychological turmoil within its master and the resilience of those who labored under its oppressive weight. The unseen influence of the late brother lingered, interweaving with the presence of the child, creating a lattice of history, consequence, and vigilance that shaped every aspect of life. The master's internal struggle deepened with each passing day. The child, though yet unborn, had become the axis of obsession, moral contemplation, and strategic calculation. Questions of inheritance, legitimacy, and societal perception dominated his thoughts. How could he reconcile the existence of this child with his understanding of family, law, and morality? Could he suppress acknowledgement without violating conscience, social expectation, or the fragile hierarchy of the plantation? Each scenario he envisioned carried implications that were as unpredictable as they were terrifying, and each day the child's presence became a silent but undeniable force shaping behavior and thought. The pregnant woman, in turn, drew strength from intuition, knowledge, and the quiet heartbeat of the life she carried. Her awareness of the master's obsession allowed her to navigate dangerous waters, using the subtle language of posture, gaze, and timing to protect herself. Each interaction with overseers and laborers alike was calculated to maintain survival, conceal knowledge, and ensure that the life she carried could persist in the face of scrutiny and potential violence. The child represented not only vulnerability but resilience, a living assertion of continuity, defiance, and the inescapable presence of truth. The estate became a theater of psychological tension, where fear and survival were in constant interplay. Laborers learned to read shifts in attention, subtle changes in the master's demeanor, and the pregnant woman's careful adjustments. Conversations, whether whispered or casual, were layered with meaning, each word scrutinized for signs of knowledge, emotion, or intention. In this charged atmosphere, every action was amplified, every decision consequential, and every moment steeped in the awareness of mortality, secrecy, and human persistence. In the quiet of the night, the master wrestled with sleeplessness, pacing his study and reflecting on the moral, social, and personal consequences of the hidden truth. Rage and guilt intermingled with fascination and fear, creating a psychological tempest that permeated both private thought and public action. He understood that the child represented more than a complication. It embodied the persistence of life, the defiance of imposed hierarchy, and the moral weight of actions long concealed. To ignore this presence was impossible, yet to acknowledge it fully carried risks that threatened the stability of his authority, the perception of family, and the order of the estate. The pregnant woman's instincts guided her through this labyrinth. She interpreted subtle cues from the master and overseers, adjusted her behavior to maintain safety, and learned to assert agency quietly and effectively. Her awareness of the stakes, the value of concealment, the power of presence, and the necessity of resilience allowed her to navigate a space dominated by fear and control while preserving the life growing within her. Each movement of the child became a source of quiet affirmation, a pulse that mirrored the persistence of will, intellect, and agency against forces determined to suppress it. The estate, under the weight of revelation, fear, and survival, existed as a complex ecosystem. Power was not absolute, obedience not guaranteed, and truth, once revealed, had a life of its own. The pregnant woman became a focal point for these intersecting dynamics, her presence shaping the behavior of both master and laborers, influencing perception, and challenging the rigid structures designed to enforce hierarchy and dominance. The unborn child was both silent and persistent, a reminder of life's inevitability and the limitations of control. The master's moral and strategic calculation continued to evolve. He weighed every possible course of action, from concealment to confrontation, from negotiation to suppression. Each option carried implications for inheritance, social perception, and authority. The tension between fear, power, and moral reckoning was inescapable, manifesting in restless nights, obsessive attention, and the pervasive sense that the plantation itself had become an organism of suspense and consequence. He began to see that the child's very existence was a catalyst for change, a force that could not be ignored, suppressed, or controlled without creating cascading consequences that would touch every corner of the estate. The pregnant woman, meanwhile, navigated her world with extraordinary acuity. She moved with the precision of someone intimately familiar with danger and consequence, using silence, observation, and subtle manipulation to maintain survival. Each day was a negotiation between vulnerability and strength, between concealment and assertion, and between the oppressive structures of authority and the quiet, persistent assertion of life. The child became a guide, a constant pulse of resilience that informed decision-making and shaped her interactions with those around her. As the months progressed, the estate continued to operate under a fragile equilibrium defined by fear, vigilance, and the unspoken awareness of hidden truth. Laborers adjusted behavior instinctively, responding to subtle cues in posture, gaze, and tone. The master's obsession with inheritance and legitimacy remained ever present, influencing every interaction, instruction, and observation. The pregnant woman's agency, though carefully concealed, exerted influence quietly and decisively, shaping perception and challenging authority in ways that were invisible yet undeniable. Even the landscape of the plantation seemed imbued with the tension and anticipation. The swaying of the crops, the rustling of leaves, and the shifting shadows cast by the sun all contributed to an atmosphere thick with unspoken communication and latent potential. Life persisted amidst fear, authority, and secrecy, a reminder that the persistence of being could disrupt the most meticulously constructed hierarchies and legacies. In the quiet moments of reflection, the master understood the full implications of his discovery. He was no longer merely an authority figure overseeing labor and land. He was a participant in a web of moral complexity, social consequence, and human resilience that challenged every assumption he had held. The child, though unseen, had reshaped the landscape of power, morality, and survival, asserting the inevitability of truth and the persistence of life. The pregnant woman, aware of the delicate balance she maintained, drew strength from the silent heartbeat of the child and the instinctual intelligence that guided her actions. She navigated the plantation with a blend of caution, insight, and quiet assertion, preserving both her own life and the life growing within her. Each day became a testament to survival, adaptation, and the subtle yet profound influence of concealed truth. And so, the legacy of fear and survival endured. The plantation, though physically unchanged, was transformed into a space defined by the interplay of observation, accuracy, resilience, and the enduring force of life. The master, burdened by knowledge and obsession, and the pregnant woman, guided by instinct and intelligence, existed within this tension, their actions, decisions, and perceptions continually shaped by the child's silent presence. In this intricate dance of fear and survival, the legacy of the late brother persisted, interwoven with the new reality, creating a tableau where life, truth, and resilience asserted themselves against the weight of authority and history. The child, still unseen but palpably present, became the ultimate testament to the enduring power of existence amidst oppression. It was a reminder that even in environments meticulously structured by control, authority, and fear, life could assert itself quietly, persistently, and irreversibly. The plantation's rhythms, labor, and hierarchies continued, but they were forever altered, infused with the knowledge that hidden truths, once revealed, could never be entirely contained. In the end, the estate existed as a study in contrasts, authority tempered by fear, obedience shadowed by vigilance, secrecy countered by resilience, and life persisting despite oppression. The pregnant woman and her unborn child embodied this delicate equilibrium, navigating a world of risk, moral ambiguity, and survival with intelligence, caution, and quiet defiance. The master, though obsessed and horrified, remained bound within the constraints of his own conscience and authority, forced to acknowledge the power of a truth that could not be denied. Within this tense, charged environment, the legacy of fear and survival became inseparable, shaping behavior, influencing decisions, and redefining the estate's moral and social landscape. Every heartbeat, every step, every whispered glance carried the weight of history and the promise of endurance. The plantation, while unchanged in structure, had become a crucible where human resilience, authority, and the inevitability of truth converged, leaving an indelible mark on all who lived, labored, and persisted within its bounds.